All right, greetings and welcome to another podcast episode with Aaron Craig. And my guest speaker today is Catherine McClintock, who has been working in archival preservation in a lot of different forms. And what we're going to talk about today is preservation, but we're going to heavily focus more in on video game preservation, what that looks like, what's happening now, and maybe what, as game developers, we can do to get our games preserved for the future. Catherine, say hi.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, Aaron. Good to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited. So I've known Catherine for a long time, and she is a wonderful person, and I'm super excited for today's conversation. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. So first off, I know this wasn't on the list of questions, but tell me just about your history. Where did you go to school? What did you do? And what got you into preservation in the first place?
Yeah. So my pathway probably wasn't the normal pathway a lot of people take to get an MLIS degree, but I got my bachelor's in psychology um, at George Fox University, um, and that really sparked my love of research. So I spent a lot of time in libraries, speaking with the librarians on staff, and also with the archivist we had at school, because it was a research institution and people would come to the archive with research questions. And that sort of got my eye shifted from psychology to actually helping people with information, helping them access information and do research, because that was my favorite part of my psych degree, was doing research. Um, so when I was looking for master's programs to go into, I was really interested in information science programs. So I got into an MLIS degree, and one of the concentrations was archival preservation, and I was super interested in that. And I took the intro class, and I was hooked, and that's where I stayed. So, yeah.
Nice. And right now you're over in Boston, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
there's a lot of history from, at least in the US standpoint, over on that side of the coast. And that's kind of where a lot of things have happened and where a lot of things are happening, right?
Yeah. In terms of manuscript preservation, museums, that sort of thing, the East Coast is really big on those things.
Yeah, and that makes sense. So you're right in the heart of it. And so you've been there, you've learned about it, and now I get to drill you for information about it, which is very exciting. So let's go ahead and start with just a super broad question, just to make sure that everyone who's listening is on the same page. What is media preservation? Like, what does that even mean or entail?
hmm Yeah. So archives and cultural heritage institutions, their main goal is to preserve manuscripts and sometimes objects, anything that is a documentary of our past and our present, so that future individuals can do research with those materials or just understand what life was like in the past, to inform their future institutions and personal lives. And a lot of times that entails interventions in a physical way, because all physical mediums degrade. Um, and sometimes that means digitization in our modern sphere, because we have the ability to digitize things now. And it also means very frequently working within frameworks of copyright and donor agreements to figure out what we can make available to people, and for how long, because sometimes things can't be left out in the sun or in light on display. So you have to kind of balance keeping things stable and preserved with making them accessible to people who are interested in them. And that is a major tenet of modern archive, is that if you're going to preserve something, you should make it accessible to people. Because if it isn't
Mm,
accessible, what's the point of preserving it?
yeah.
That didn't always used to be the opinion of archivists, but in this modern day, it is, which is good in my opinion. Um, and it goes the same for media in terms of audiovisual media. Uh, a lot of archival history has been focused on manuscripts, like things like letters or books, the Declaration of Independence, like those sorts of things. But now, as technology has advanced, people are realizing that important information is on audiovisual media. And in terms of government documents, things like Nixon's tape, like it's important that we preserve those for historical purposes, but also important films that MoMA preserves, the Library of Congress preserves. Those are also included in the audiovisual medium that we want to preserve nowadays.
Yeah, it's a big leap, right? Because everything before, I don't know. I mean, before they invented cameras and recorders, everything was written. And so you had this physical thing where you had to take it. You could maybe make a copy of it. I don't know how it doesn't, you take that, but you got to keep it in good condition. But now you've got things that are digital and are making a big impact. So how do things like movies and art and songs and music get preserved? What's the process for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of archivists are like peripherally trained to preserve audiovisual media because you might get a donation from a family whose family member recently passed away and it has a lot of papers in it, but then there might be a floppy disk. And you have to know how to deal with that, even though most of it is the traditional archival manuscript type of thing. But there are institutions that focus primarily on movies or primarily on sound. And there's an institution, Northeast Historic Film, near me. I had an internship there, and they focus specifically on home videos or independent films that feature the Northeast. And so normally stuff like that, it gets donated, or it might be an acquisition where they make an agreement with a donor that they will steward the objects and exhibit them in a way that the donor wants, or sometimes it will be purchased. And once those materials come into the archive, people have to figure out, what order should they be kept in, what order should they be exhibited in, because context is extremely important in archives. The way somebody organized their film in their collection has meaning because it had meaning to the person who organized them. And sometimes it's a big conglomeration of stuff people left on your porch in a garbage bag, and it has no structure, and you have to create a responsible structure for them. And you have to create metadata, the length of the film, the format it's on, if it has a magnetic strip or sound. And there's all these different structures and frameworks that archivists have created to create that metadata specific to the format so that it can be easily searched for, catalog records can be made for it. And then, of course, you have to you have to assess the condition that those objects are in. If they are decaying to a certain degree where they can't be exhibited, and you just have to try and keep them from disintegrating even further, or if it's something you can do some conservation work on, then you have to assess the copyright, if it's something you are allowed to exhibit or not. And then you have to find a home for it on your shelves. And if you don't have a lot of space, sometimes you have to assess whether or not that collection is worth keeping. And a lot of archivists would say that they would like to keep everything. The director of Northeast Historic Film told me a story about how he thought this one film they had was like the most worthless piece of media they were preserving. And it was just this film of this empty coastline. And then one day a marine biologist came and was like, this video was so helpful to me because it helped me document the erosion of like the beach. And he had thought no one would ever use that, but somebody did. And so he was telling me it's so hard to get rid of anything, knowing that it could be useful for future generations. But sometimes space and funding is so much an issue that you have to make that decision. So those are the basic steps for physical preservation. When it comes to digital preservation, there's a lot of ways you can digitize something. And depending on if it's a film or a picture or a song, you might digitize it in a different file format, a different wrapper, or have a different codec for compression. And a lot of institutions will have kind of a tiered access model. where they will keep the original physical item because oftentimes those physical items are more resilient than digital items. Digital items are harder to upkeep than physical items. And then they will have a digital master, which is often not compressed at all, which never gets accessed by people. It sits in a digital cloud server that does a lot of maintenance on them, runs checksums automatically to make sure that it's not bit rotting at all. And so no one will ever touch that. It'll just stay there. And then you have a mezzanine copy that is probably lossless compressed with an approved codec that is supportive and supported and transparent and will probably stick around for a while. And that mezzanine copy will only be accessed if people need a copy that is of higher resolution, or if they need to make another access copy off of the mezzanine copy. And then the access copy is often lossy compressed. It doesn't have as high resolution as the mezzanine or master copy, but people can access it however much they want, and they can make new access copies if they need to off the mezzanine copy. And there's an entire workflow that goes on for digital items to make sure that, you know, they're transferred to a new file format. The one they're on is becoming obsolete, that the codec that they're compressed with is still supported and they don't need to move it over to another one. If they're running checksums, they're making sure that they can still open the files and that sort of thing, that they still open on whatever operating system is widespread. There's so many issues with digital preservation, but if something is digitally made available, it's much easier for people to access than the physical. If we're using the example of film still, I mean, you have to take it out of storage. If it was frozen, you have to let it acclimate to the temperature. Then you have to have a projector, and then you run the risk of having the film sprockets being torn when you're projecting it. And so if you have a digital file, even if people have to travel to the archives to be able to access it, it's better for the physical material, and it makes it more likely that archivists will be able to exhibit those to people in the future.
Yeah, so that was a lot of steps right there, and I already have like 8 different questions. So I guess let me break down, and you tell me if I'm summarizing this properly, because I don't want to lose too many people with the technical jargon, because you were throwing out some ideas there, and I just want to try to summarize them as best as possible. So when it comes to digital media, like let's take an example of, let's start with a photo, right? So a lot of people, the photos that you look at and that you take are common compressed formats like JPEG or MPEG, some MPG, something like that, where it's like 3 to 4 megabytes. It's small, but that's the compressed version. The uncompressed, the lossless raw version is going to be like 30 to 50 megabytes for one photo. And then you convert that into a film, and all of a sudden you've got a film that's 2 to 3 gigabytes that you can easily fit on your phone, to something that is hundreds or maybe thousands of gigabytes for one single film. And you get the idea of having that master copy, which you talked about, this lossless, this uncompressed master copy that never gets touched, that's always preserved. And then you've got a middle one where it is compressed, but at the lowest compression available, so that it's still big and should be the the best quality you can have, and that then you can then have that accessible to people. Is that kind of that's what you're talking about? Is that a good summation there?
Yeah, exactly. And you were saying that, for the uncompressed master copy, that is so many gigabytes, and it is, and a lot of institutions struggle with that, with keeping, storing all of those gigabytes, and paying for that storage because it's expensive. And the New York Public Library has recently had a huge push of digitizing a lot of materials that belong to them, that don't belong to them, that they're digitizing for people. They have actually implemented a workflow where their master copies are losslessly compressed, which some archives would turn their noses up at, but they have so much material that it's just not financially feasible for them to have them not compressed at all. So it would be, not having these things digitized, or having the masters digitized but compressed, and they've chosen to make these things accessible, even though you're not doing it the way that people would in the perfect world like prescribe.
Yeah. Yeah. Size, like you go from physically preserving documents and film to running out of storage space in your locker to then running out of digital space on your hard drive. And even with servers, like you still have to buy them. And when it comes to preserving all of the digital media, like you need, it goes from megabyte to gigabyte to terabyte to petabyte to zettabyte, and then there's one above that, and it becomes incredibly expensive even for massive companies that deal with that kind of data. You have to pay for it. And I guess the question that I had when you started talking about preserving, like you receive a donation, is there a standard for what is accepted to be preserved? Like, can just a Joe off the street go to a preservation and be like, "Hey, this is something I made. You should preserve it because I'm cool." Like, how does that work? Like, is there a level of hierarchy or historical importance that someone has to have for something to be preserved?
Yeah, that's a great question because we often get um, donations of things that are, I mean, obviously somebody cared very deeply about them, but it's not something that we can devote the time to preserve.
Hmm.
Um, and that's why it's encouraged. And most archives and cultural heritage institutions will have them written out, but they often have a collection development policy. So in terms of Northeast Historic Film, using that as an example again, they have their collection development policy, which says they'll only accept films um, that are home movies or independent films, so like 16 millimeter, 8 millimeter, um, magnetic tape type films that have something to do with the Northeast or an
Hmm.
institution in the Northeast or somebody famous from the Northeast. So it really nails down the kinds of things that they are willing to um, spend money preserving. And a lot of
Hmm.
other archives who have similar realms that they sort of operate in, they will create a collection development policy so that they have a basis for turning somebody away if they don't think they can properly be a steward of those materials, and point to their collection development policy. And it also helps create a focus for your archive for researchers who are interested in certain topics, because they know that this archive or museum or university has a collection of this type of material. And if they are interested in researching it, that's a prime place to go. Um,
Hmm.
and this is a little bit of a tangent, but it has to do with, I think, video game preservation as well when we get to that point. But there are a lot of community archives that do great work. And a lot of times it's of material that has not been collected by traditional archives. So the Library of Congress has an archival collection on Japanese internment camps, but it's from a government perspective, and it's like their documents that they had and their photos that they had. But there's a great community archive uh, online on YouTube where they interview people who lived in Japanese internment camps, and they're just like these short, like 2 or 3 minute long YouTube interviews, but they give a completely different perspective of what
Hmm.
that was like. And so a lot of communities have found that archives that exist don't collect the things that are important to them, especially marginalized communities, and they've banded together and made their own archives. And maybe they don't follow all of um, the practice literature of how to do an archive correctly, but they are preserving the things that are important to them that wouldn't have otherwise, that would have been lost otherwise. And that's, their efforts are really important to recognize. Um, so sometimes when Joe Schmo wants to donate something to an archive and it doesn't get accepted, he'll go and find people who have materials like his and make an archive together with them, which is really cool too.
That is. And having archives be specifically by like region or topic makes a lot of sense and something that never even crossed my mind. I was just imagining this vast interconnected network that just stores everything that ever existed, but that's not possible at least in our day and age. So you have to have things like that in certain areas or for communities or things like that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
So the last question before we jump into the video game preservation specifically is, why is it important to preserve things in our digital age? Because people throw things up on the internet and then everybody saves a copy. It's on there forever. If it's on the internet, it's permanent, is what they say. And so if there's so many people with millions of devices that already have it, copied in one form or another, why is it so important to archive the digital media and things of our day?
So, yeah, that's a great question because I think a lot of people have that perception of digital media that if it's on the internet, it's preserved. If it's digital, it's safe from decay. And I think it's because a lot of us are very familiar with watching our physical items degrade, like photographs or papers, and watching digital things degrade isn't as immediate to us. And it seems like everything is still accessible to us because we're not aware of what isn't accessible to us anymore.
Mm,
Um, and a lot there, I mean, I'm sure people have heard of the Internet Archive. Uh, it's
yeah.
a great repository. But the Internet Archive, like the things that have been archived in a way that will be resiliently preserved for years, it probably doesn't even cover 1% of all of the things that have been on the internet. The internet is huge. And when web pages aren't posted anymore, they get lost and their content on it is lost. And then things that linked to it are lost. Um, and also, a lot of things on the internet are not things that are accessible to web crawlers. So it's not something that you'll be able to find in a Google search. It's
Mm,
something that's hidden behind a wall, a paywall, or an institutional access wall. Um, and the internet is becoming more monetized, and information
yeah.
on the internet isn't as free as people assumed it would be when the internet was first created. Um, and so it's like the analogy of film, that early film, black and white film from the 20s to the 50s. It's estimated, and it's an estimate because we have no idea, that we only have 25% of all of them that were ever made because there wasn't a framework for preserving it. People didn't think about preserving it. And they just left them in their basement and they degraded and they're impossible to rescue. And digital items are very difficult to maintain, expensive to maintain. You have to constantly do work on them. And a lot of these articles, web pages, um, they are maintained by companies that have to pay for their maintenance. And once they aren't being accessed or bringing in revenue or ad revenue, they are removed. Um, and it's through things like the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine that you can find these older versions of web pages. Um, I'm just recently working on a project improving our library website, and I was going to my undergraduate institution's library website to use it as an example, and they had changed the website from when I went to school there. And I was trying to find the previous version of the website, and if it hadn't been archived via the Wayback Machine, there would have been no way for me to find that, show my colleagues what I was talking about. Um, and there are plenty of web pages that never got archived by the Wayback Machine and are gone.
Hmm.
And it might seem like we have access to all the information in the world, but that's just because we have no way of knowing what has been lost, unless people who notice tell us. And sometimes it's hard to notice because there's so much out there.
We need a digital remember all. We can squeeze it and
Mm-hmm.
remember everything that we've ever forgotten, right? Because
Yeah.
that's a really powerful sentiment, that you don't know what you've lost because you don't have it anymore. You don't recognize it, you don't miss it. So
Mm-hmm.
that's very interesting.
And it gets compounded too when you realize that um, this is very poignant in the film example, that a lot of those early films that we have are the films that were made by prominent people in society that
Mm,
people deemed more important. So there were a lot of films made by women in the 20s, in the 1920s, that we know were made because we have heard people talking about them, but we don't have them because films made by marginalized communities were not as important on the preserving or making multiple copies of lists of the powers of be in that day.
Mm.
So if you think about the things that are going to be lost first, are the things that we probably want to keep to give that holistic experience of what it meant to live in this time frame, in this culture. So if we don't preserve things more holistically, we're going to get a very one-sided view of history in the next 100 years when people are looking back.
Yeah, they're going to remember the Transformers movies, but not the things that actually mattered, which is highly unfortunate. So we've talked about what preservation is, why it's important, and kind of how it's done. Now let's transition into video games, because just from an idea standpoint, preserving video games is fundamentally different than anything else we've talked about, because art, pieces of paper, film, all of those things are what they are. Like, they don't change when you see them, but games are by nature interactive. So so you explain more in detail, how are video game preservation, how is that different than everything else?
You highlighted one of the main reasons already, is that it is interactive. It requires a person, sometimes multiple people. And in many modern games and even some older games, there are multiple pathways to take in finishing a game. And so you couldn't just have one person play through it and record it, because that's going to be an incomplete representation of the game. And game I was recently looking at, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, you could have somebody get the same ending in the game, but explore completely different parts of the castle. And so you're not seeing the entirety of the game by just watching a singular person play it. So the challenge becomes, how do you want to preserve the game, and what you're preserving it for? And this goes into the second reason why video game preservation is different from other forms of preservation, is there's an overload of information to document. And I mean, there's already backlogs with other physical forms, physical documents that archivists need to preserve. But in terms of a single video game, there's so much to document that you have to pick and choose what you want to document, and you have to make a decision within a single entity instead of just a decision within a whole collection of what you're going to keep and what you're not going to keep. And I think another significant difference is copyright law in the US, because there is a provision where librarians and archivists can make copies of a book or a manuscript. That's mainly in libraries, because you would want to keep the original in an archive. But in a library, if a book is falling apart or it needs to be conserved and you can't get a new copy of it, you can make a new copy of that book if it's too expensive for you to buy another one, or if it just doesn't exist. Or if it's falling apart, you could send it to get rebound, and that's perfectly fine. But in terms of a video game on a floppy disk, and all video games that are on a floppy disk or an optical drive from the 80s or the 90s, their lifespan for that media that they're on is either ending or has been over for a long time. So those games need to get migrated to another format yesterday. And so if you want to do that, a library or an archive can't just do that like they could with a book, because a lot of those games have digital rights management software on them. And the copyright section 1201 says that if you have to break any sort of digital rights management, you are not able to make a copy or migrate it to a new format. So a lot of video game archives have whole collections of video games that are just rotting away, that they can't do anything with, because they aren't allowed to break that digital rights management legally, and have it in their collection. So
Mm.
that is a major obstacle when it comes to video games that isn't really present with other forms of material.
Yeah, DRM is every gamer's favorite thing. You know, I'm sure everybody just loves it. So, but that's very interesting. So you got the legal side where you have legal side when it comes to preserving film, movies, art, things like that, but you also have it on the game side. So that's a very interesting thing that I didn't know. So what kinds of things can be done? Do they have to contact the developer, the publisher? Like, just like what happens?
Yeah. There is a provision. You can request from a developer to be able to migrate it to a new format, but the process for doing so is very muddy and hard to navigate,
Mm,
and it takes a lot of time. And if an archive can work on migrating a different game that they don't have to worry about because it's out of copyright or it's an orphan work, they might just spend their time doing that instead, um, because they have limited time and limited resources. And um, the process is so muddy legally that even if you're trying to follow the legal guidelines, you're worried that you might mess up and then be liable. And so it can be safer for them to just avoid that altogether
yeah.
until a wider copyright modification has happened. And in 2018, in US copyright law, they said that archives were able to copy over games that were not commercially accessible anymore. You had no other way of purchasing that game. Um,
Mm.
you were able to do that, but they are not able to make them accessible to people who aren't able to travel to the archive or libraries.
Yeah, that right there becomes, I mean, like you said, muddy, I think is the best word for it because a lot of the companies who made these games are still around in one form or another. And if they can sell it, they're
Mm-hmm.
going to try to make money off of it, especially in this day of reboots and remakes and everything coming back that was old. Those floppy disk games are now what they're selling to us for $60, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's interesting. But so if they can take a game and they can preserve it if it's not available commercially, but you have to go there. They can't just make it available online for anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, you can, in the US at least, you can appeal for copyright modifications every 3 years. And in 2018, they said that you were able to copy games that were no longer commercially available. And in 2021, they appealed to make their game collections accessible to people who weren't able to travel to the archive, which is pertinent for COVID time. And
Yeah.
that was struck down, and they weren't able to incorporate that into copyright law. Um, so every 3 years, so 2024, they could try something new, but you never know. There are a lot of big names that are opposed to this. Um, like you said, companies that want to monetize old games, they don't know. Maybe somebody will do a reboot of this franchise that they have the rights to, and they weren't planning on, making that available and putting it in their game store, but now they can make money off of it if somebody made a movie. And so maybe it wasn't like commercially accessible, but now it is because they want to sell it. So they don't have a lot of reasons to um, let archives and libraries let users stream game experiences from long distances because it would eat into their potential future profits that they may have.
Yeah. And so when it comes to more modern games, like you're talking about games with multiple endings, multiple players, even things like MMOs, which are an entirely different question subject, maybe a different podcast there. But you've got things like that. Um, how are those things preserved? Like, do you just rip the code and then for someone who goes into the museum, they can play that game? Is it, you talked about recording videos of people playing it with multiple endings, things like that. Like, how does that happen right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that brings me to a really good video game collection in the Strong Museum of Play in New York, I believe. And they collect things like board games, really old games, And they
Mm.
also have a really robust video game collection. They have like arcade games and console games, and they've run into this issue even with older games that you wouldn't think of being as complex as newer games. So what they do for older games is applicable to newer games and then some. So in their collections, what they'll do is they will have the source code of the game. And in terms of games that have multiple updates, maybe they might have different levels of code for the different versions of the game. And they will also collect um, posters advertising the game manual, cover art. They'll collect internal documents from the company that made the game, storyboards, um, inspirations for the game that the developers cite, all of these things um, that are behind the scenes sort of documentation that give the context um, around the game when it was developed. What was it doing that it was taking from other games that had come before? What was it doing that had never been done before? And you can only really understand that in the context of all of those different documents.
Yeah.
Um, so that's something to do with their games there, and they're talking about like Atari games and arcade games that you wouldn't think of being as narratively complex as more modern games. So with more modern games, that is a big topic that archivists who are in the video game preservation sphere are talking about because it is so complex and there's so many different ways of going about it. So everything that you would do for older games, you would continue to try to do with these newer games. But there's also more strategies that they're looking into. So that would be doing interviews with people who play the game about why they play the game. Do they play them because they play with friends? Do they play them because they want to play by themselves to relax? Or, they play a horror game not to relax, but, to be excited by it. And in MMOs, there's so many different ways to play them. You play them because you like crafting or being in a guild or doing raids or just exploring. And having those interviews can give you why individuals play. And then having videos of people play in an MMO scenario can kind of give you a feeling of what it is like to play them because you're running around with other people, you're being cooperative. There's the in-game chat, and so you're trying to have all of those things that make an MMO so specific in your preservation. So you'll have those interviews, and then you'll have like let's play videos with different gameplay styles, and you'll have the documentation from the internal game development company if you can get it, and you'll try and document different versions of the game if that's possible at all. Sometimes it's not as easy, and sometimes archivists have learned that you need to collaborate with players because players play the games because they love them, and oftentimes they are preserving things about the game that they really like. Old models of trees that have gotten updated, people will save them because they want people to know what the game looked like when it first came out because
Mm.
they love the experience. And so archivists have learned that it takes a lot of time for an archivist who's never played this game to go in the game and figure out what the culture is and figure out what they need to preserve. But if you work with people who are already in the game, then that can save you a lot of time and give you a unique perspective of what playing the game is like. My favorite example, no, to my knowledge, no one has done this, but a group of archivists were saying that this would be a good idea, was that like in MMOs there are guilds and player groups, and working with a development company to have a guild in the game that is dedicated to preserving the game, like as different versions come out. And then every once in a while they'll meet with the archivists that work with a development company and kind of like talk and like report their findings. But then you just let these players who are dedicated to this kind of interaction with their game do that work for you and save what they think is important about the game. Because there are role-playing guilds and guilds that go do raids and guilds that craft, and I could definitely see there being enough people who are interested in preserving game to be in the preservation guild. So that's something that's been expressed as a possibility, but I don't think I've ever seen that be done. But there is a lot of complexity to how people interact with modern games.
Yeah, that's a really neat idea. Something that I could definitely see taking off in the future if there aren't already some small groups, like you mentioned, people taking videos and photos of how things used to be. This idea as well is very interesting because when it comes to games that change over their life, so like games as a service and MMO games, which are most everything is games as a service these days. You go from version 1, which a lot of times is buggy and has issues, but people still play it and love it, to then 7 years down the road, it's barely even looks the same. And so you call it the same game, but for someone who played version 1 versus version 100, it's not. And preserving something like that is a tremendous amount of work where I imagine someone or an entire group could spend years doing something just like that for one game, which isn't very feasible when it comes to how much there is to preserve. So, I mean, that's just a point. It's not a question at all. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah, and that issue comes up with other forms of preservation too in organizations that create reams and reams and reams of documents. And there is actually a style of preservation where you will just take sort of like a random percentage of all of those documents and preserve those because you don't have the ability to preserve everything. So you'll just try to get like a little slice of the flavor of what that company was
Hmm.
in terms of like a company creating documentation. Um, and sometimes that's the most feasible way of preserving something, even if it's not a satisfactory way of preserving something.
Yeah, it comes back to the limitation of space, physical and digital, but also time and resources. You don't have the archivation or archive. I don't know. Archiving is not a big profitable industry like gaming is. And so you
Mm-hmm.
don't have billions of dollars every year to go and spend on employees and infrastructure. It'd be nice, but it's not the world we live in right now. So you've mentioned a couple companies, but what are some organizations, companies, universities that are specifically preserving games right now? And I'll throw some
Yeah,
links down below as well. And
mhm.
wherever you're listening or watching, I'll put some links to these as well.
Awesome. That's great. Um, yes, there are lots of cultural heritage institutions that are trying to preserve games. I mentioned the Strong Game of Play that has a group dedicated to video games specifically. There's the Game Preservation Special Interest Group of the International Game Developers Association, and they try to get people together to create guidelines and white papers and documentation that can guide people. There's more general institutions like the Computer History Museum in California, and they're dedicated to computers, and so they have a lot of the hardware and software and emulators available for people to go and see. And also that the fact that they're doing that work and keeping that hardware up and running means that some of that software, is video games. So they might have like a working Commodore 64 with a game that you can play on it. And it's different than emulating it because there's a different keyboard layout, putting the little cartridge into the back of the keyboard, like it's a different experience. And
Hmm.
so they have kind of like a very interesting niche on that. And internationally, I know there's the National Video Game Archive in the UK. There's the European Federation of Game Preservation. I mentioned the Internet Archive before, that they also have a ton of games on there that you can play in your browser, and they're emulated for you in the browser. And they also have something called the Archiving Virtual Worlds Initiative, where people will upload videos of them playing games. Or I saw in there a couple of Halo assets that never got actually deployed in the game, but they had
Ooh,
the models of them. And
that's
there's a
cool.
video of Space War being played on the computer that it was made for. I think it was one of the first video games people ever made. Um, and so they have people upload their experience with those games. And it's dedicated to MMOs mostly. So people can archive their experience playing MMOs in some way. And it doesn't have some of the pitfalls copyright wise, because it's user made videos that they're uploading to the archive, not for any sort of monetary gain. So that's a really interesting project.
Cool. And one of the things you've touched on quite a bit is that context is important, especially when it comes to games, because there's so much context around them. Like, one of the first examples that comes to my mind is kind of a negative thing, but it shaped my experience when it came to playing like Super Nintendo games, because they're physical cartridges that can degrade and die over time. And I've come back to a game that I've been playing, like a long RPG, and I put it in and it doesn't work, or the save file has gotten corrupted. And you've got this context of, I just lost 20 hours of progress and I cannot get it back. And then the next time I come to it, I'm even more determined to beat it. And so you if you go to emulate something like that, it's like, well, you get the game, but you don't really get the experience of, you don't actually know that you're going to be able to continue next time you pick up that controller. And that, preserving something like that is quite a feat.
Yeah. And a lot of archivists are focused on migration and emulation because that's the best long term solution. And it's hard enough just to keep emulators up to date. But some archivists and museums especially are really good about this, because their whole domain, effective experience of being able to have a console in your museum with the cartridge, so, and with the cathode ray television, so that people can experience the games like they were when they came out. My audio visual archives professor, she was demonstrating that, and she just went like that in front of us talking about video games, and we were all like, oh yeah, we've had that experience of like blowing on a cartridge to get the dust out, and you're not supposed to do that because we can get moisture on the pins, but
It says not to do
everybody
it
did
on
it.
the cartridge, but everybody does it.
Yeah, and future generations who are playing these games on emulators, either online emulators they found, or Nintendo games that are running within an emulator on a Switch, like they're not going to have that experience.
Yeah.
And that's a part of the experience. And so some archives and museums are focusing on that specifically, that effective experience of the physical hardware that you had to use to play games. You didn't have save state. You just had whatever saving mechanism they gave you in the game, which sometimes was a drag, but it was a part of the experience.
It was. And that's a conversation right there of save states, because a lot of games are designed specifically with saves in mind, because it makes it either more difficult or easier. And if you can just press a button and save wherever you are and reload instantly, that destroys the intent of the game developer. Which for some people, they wouldn't play it otherwise, but for other people, they won't play it that way because it's not the game anymore. It's fundamentally a different game. It's like the conversation of how difficult games should be, and should a game have an easy mode, which not related in the slightest, but that effective experience. I like that phrase. That's cool. So, how would you preserve a game from from the beginning console area, either from an older console or even a modern console? Like, what are the steps if you were to be assigned to go and preserve, let's PS4 games or PS5 games or something like that? What would you do? How would you do that?
Yeah, so I probably follow the example of the Strong Museum of Play, and try to get a lot of the surrounding documentation of the game. That would probably be your hardest obstacle, depending on the company. But things like business records, source material. I remember watching a documentary of somebody who was designing the text in an arcade game, and they drew out their little like 8x8 squares that they had to work with, and would like draw the little squares into it on graph paper to decide where they wanted to put their pixel, make an M, like, and it was on paper. Like that sort of thing is something that you would want to have preserved if they use that sort of like pen and paper method to design their game. Um, and then you have the actual hardware and software. And for me, and some archvists would probably disagree, I think if there was hardware still available, I would want to collect it and have it in my archive for people to come into the archive and play it on that physical medium.
Mm.
I think that's important. I put a lot of stock in the effective experience. Um, I've had experience emulating games that I also have physically on a Super Nintendo, and emulating sound from Super Nintendo games is very difficult. And
Mm.
so a lot of emulators don't reproduce the sound correctly. And Top Gear 2 has 4 songs in the whole game, and they all slap, and they don't play correctly in an emulator. And I think that is a huge experience of games. I mean, music is a huge experience of games. Even
Mm-hmm.
older games, they have really great tracks. Um, so if it was possible to allow people to experience the game in the console, preserving the console, I would probably go for that. And that often means, buying as many consoles as you can find. Have like 5 working Super Nintendos in your archive so that when one of them goes kaput, you can take parts from the other one or switch it out. That is important. And I have heard of archives doing that when they have to have physical hardware to provide access to the things that they have in their collection.
Mm.
And then I would probably look to uh, take that source code from the game and preserve that and have multiple copies and backup, and have an emulator to run it in just for access terms, and also making sure it's not stuck on something that is going to degrade over time and we're not going to be able to access it in the future. I think that is very important. And you might have to go through copyright to do that, or if it's an orphan work or it's old enough that it's out of copyright, which is unlikely with video games, you don't have to worry about that. But going through whatever process you have to try and get it migrated into some sort of long-lasting or longer-lasting digital format, I think would be very imperative. And
Mm.
then you have the important work of making metadata for it, making sure that people online who are searching for it, it'll come up in a Google search because crawlers can find that metadata and make it accessible to people, as accessible as we're allowed to make it to people, so they can know, oh, I can travel to Michigan to play this game. I'm not going to travel to Michigan to play this game, but if I wanted to, if I was a researcher
You
studying this
could.
game, I could.
Yeah.
That's very important.
So there's a lot that you would do. And it's not just like, oh, I have a disc, let me just throw it on and rip it and I'm done. There's a whole lot more to it than that when it comes to video game preservation. And I think that's something that's important for people to know is even if you have the physical hardware, that's really just one part of it. The story and the context, the effective experience is vital, especially for the next generation. Like you and I, we can preserve something that we've played and we can show it to our friends and they'll understand it. But in 20 years from now, the next gen is going to grow up and they're not going to have any idea what Leroy Jenkins is. And you say that and you show them a clip of it and it's lost. And
Mm-hmm.
that that experience is important. The
Mm-hmm.
whole, yeah, the entire aspect of it, the context. And that's hard.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we're talking about the challenges and the approaches being taken, and that's awesome. So, with that in mind, what are some things that game developers can do if they're making a game to make it easier to preserve?
Absolutely. That is a great question. That is something that archivists really want. They really want to work with game designers and the gaming industry to preserve these games. Um, and I would probably say, first and foremost, whether you're an individual or if you're working in a small company, and you can afford it, um, having somebody come in, somebody who can consult for you and kind of show you the best practices for maintaining documentation, that's great,
Mm.
because there are people that will come in and do that for you and work a couple hours for a week and give you like a rundown of the best way to preserve your internal documents, because then you'll have those internal documents in the future to provide that context for your game, which it's important to preserve the game, but like we've said, and like all archivists say, context is king. And knowing why you made the game or what inspired you to make the game or the struggles in making the game and the direction you were initially going, but then you changed it to this, that's all a part of the story of the game, and making sure you have those documents is the first step in providing that context. Um, Obviously, keep backups. A lot of companies do keep backups because it's good for them monetarily. Um, but there was a survey that Archivist did with game companies. Not very many of them responded to the survey, but of the ones that did, a lot of them didn't have the uncorrupted source code of their game. They had either auctioned it off or it had been corrupted because they hadn't preserved it properly. So making sure that you have backups and that you're looking after those digital files is incredibly important.
Yeah.
Um, if you're a large enough company, maybe you could hire your own archivist or a records manager to help you know that you are doing everything you possibly can to keep those digital files safe and have good digital hygiene. Um, and then also um, working with archivists in the long run and the gaming community is also really important. Um, a lot of these community-driven efforts to archive games from gamers themselves, they can live or die on whether or not the people who produce the game endorse it or vilify it or just ignore it. Sometimes is better if you don't want to do either one of those things, um, because people can make their own servers for MMOs that have gone offline, and as
Mm-hmm.
long as people don't force them to take it down, that game is being preserved.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a delicate line with copyright, and there always is. At its best, it provides artists with the ability to create things and live off of creating those things so that they can make more of those things, which we all love. And at its worst, it can be used as a weapon by giant companies to stifle growth and destroy the public domain. And there's a balance in the middle somewhere, and a lot of architects have to learn to work within that balance. Um, so you don't have to, make a game and release it without copyright and not make any money off of it. But you can also work with archivists to make exceptions and allow them to migrate that game over to new formats and make copies if they need to. And a big one would be when those copyright changes come about every 3 years, when there's revision to the copyright law. Um, a lot of times, the people who come out are big corporations that have a vested interest in extending copyright so that it's functionally forever. And that's happened every time big revisions have been made. But if the gaming industry, if any voices from the gaming industry can come forward and say, we want there to be a provision where if the game is deteriorating, people in cultural heritage institutions can make a copy, can emulate it, and can migrate it. That would be a fundamental change in the way archivists look at preserving their video games. And we need more people than just archivists and librarians yelling at Congress to change copyright. We need people who are in the industry to do that as well.
Mm.
Yeah.
Nice. That's a lot. So
Yeah.
speak up and get informed.
Mm-hmm.
There is ways for things to change, but they won't change by themselves. Okay.
Exactly. And there's a
I'll
lot to be gained um, for having these different communities, gamers, archivists, game developers, working together, developing a common language, and understanding that we all really want the same thing at the end of the day. We want these games to be loved, we want them to make an impact, and we want them to stick around and that impact they've made, to be remembered.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you hit on a really good point, is that a lot of people might think if it's in the library or it's preserved or something, you can no longer sell it, you can't make money, and those two things are not exclusive. You
Mhm.
can have your game preserved for future and still be able to make a living off of it. It's not as simple as pressing a single button and backing it all up to an archive, but maybe one day.
Yeah.
Cool. So you've talked about a lot of different institutions, companies, ideas. I'll get links from you. They'll be available wherever you're listening or watching. But where else can we learn more or contribute to video game preservation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, Something that I have discovered is that archivists want to work with people outside of their profession to understand things better, to get things done. Um, so I would just say, reach out to people in those industries, in those groups that we're going to link below if you're interested. Um, but also like reach out to people in your community, um, and see what they're doing and what they're interested in, because people who really care about preservation are always happy to make new groups and
Mm,
to explain things and get things explained to them. Um, and that's something I've been really struck with in this profession. So don't be afraid to reach out to people. Don't be afraid to get the ball rolling. Um, and there's a lot of good resources online for this sort of thing. Um, a lot of the articles that I looked at in classes, when I was going to school for this sort of thing, and articles I looked at before this to refresh my memory, they are behind databases. So if you have access to a university or a public library institution that might pay for database subscriptions, you
mm.
might find some really good peer-reviewed journal articles written by archivists, written by game developers about the topic as well. And your friendly public librarian or university librarian will definitely be happy to help you with that. Yeah, and don't be afraid to contribute to the Internet Archive. There's a lot of great people working on little projects on the Internet Archive that will, link this is like the Harry Potter computer game, like Preservation Association, and they'll have it in their description on the Internet Archive. If you have any questions, email us. So there's a lot of really great rabbit trails that you can find in these groups to follow and get involved.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Catherine. I appreciate it. And at least for me, it's been super informative. I've certainly learned a lot and gotten my new favorite phrase of effective experience. I'm just going to throw that out everywhere now. So I
Yeah,
hope
thanks
that,
for having me.
yeah, it was great. You did a great job. And I really hope that this can really get some conversations started, because it is an important concept and we're way late to the game. Like you were
Mm-hmm.
saying, there's a lot that needs to be done yesterday, but hasn't even started. So hopefully this gets some conversations going, get the ball rolling, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, me too.
Is there anywhere that you're online that people can follow you or hit you up and ask you questions?
Oh, gee, yes. I have a Twitter. It's the Lore Archive. Um, and then, yeah, that's basically, I have a Twitter. I'm
All
not
right,
as involved as people. But
I'll
yeah, if
put
you
a
have
link to your Twitter. Yep.
questions, I will also give you my email too. Um, my work email. I'm totally happy to answer questions. This is something I'm very interested in. So, yeah,
All right. Well, I might talk to you again in the future if there's any big updates or if you have any exciting news. But it was a pleasure talking with you. Thank you very much for your time.
yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.